Hello and welcome to the Terrace Podcast. I am Craig Cairns and I am joined by two lovely gentlemen to do a wee featured episode we're going to do for this main show. I have, first of all, Craig Anderson. How are you, Craig?
I'm good, Craig. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm getting used to realising that there's a camera on me here, recording my every move and could get used and clipped on social media. I'm not sure how I feel about it.
We were just saying beforehand that we're both sitting here with blankets on, and it's like...
And now you've given it away.
I've given it away.
Like old men. I'm in my house.
Yeah.
I don't have an excuse. I should probably have my heating on higher, whereas you've at least got an excuse that you're in a workplace.
It's an expensive thing to do these days.
Exactly. And Sean, he's with us as well. How warm is your house?
I've been off today, and I must admit I've had the heating on for the bulk of today. Like, there's a weird thing about me where I would rather wear shorts and have the heating on and pay money for it than wear layers. But I do suffer for that when it comes to paying my bill time. But no, my flat's quite warm at this moment of time. But ultimately, I can't afford it. So who's the real winner here?
Seems like there's an obvious solution there, Sean. I'll leave you to work that out.
Just wear jammy bottoms or something. But no, I'll wear shorts and put the heating on. What an idiot.
Was there anything that warmed you up about researching? I should introduce what we're doing. We're going to be looking at the 1999-2000 season. We'll get into the sort of details of it in a bit. But was there anything that warmed you up when you were researching this earlier, Sean?
So it's one of those ones where it's like, right, so looking at 99-2000, I'm like, right, well, that was a long time ago. I don't even know if the season has been documented on the internet. So I was a bit worried about what we were going to talk about or how much stuff was available online. But actually, I've had quite a good laugh. Like there's loads of stuff happening. There was a load of stuff happening. There's stuff that we can't talk about because there's virtually nothing about it online. But ultimately, it felt like it was quite a good season. Like there was like Scotland stuff and lower league stuff and stuff going on in the kind of top tier. So yes, I've quite enjoyed reading up on it. There's a lot of nonsense, certainly.
Yeah, and quite a lot of that nonsense was well documented. As you say, there's not a ton of stuff well documented, but there are some of the more interesting things that were there. Did you find that as well, Craig?
Yeah, and it's something I find that little era, doing my research and as I do for kind of stats and all the rest of it, that little era is a bit of a black spot in Scottish football. I would say anything from about 2004, 5, 6 onwards is up to date on the internet in the sense that websites that were around then are still around now and are still up to date with stats, videos, whatever, reports. A lot of stuff from the kind of mid to late 90s is there because people started researching, and then there seems to be this wee gap from kind of late, like 1998, 99 to kind of early 2000s where it's as if it didn't exist. It's a bit like the kind of footballing equivalent of the Dark Ages, where you can start having these, if we didn't live through it, you'd have these conspiracy theories as to whether they actually happened or not. So we do have that aspect, but there was enough information on some of the things that I wanted to talk about. And I think this is a great idea. I think we're launching this as a new series with a main show, and I think the point will be that it will become a Patreon series, is my understanding. And with that,
so you're doing my work for me there, Craig.
I think it's a good one to start on. It's just to remind the listeners of that.
No, thanks, and reminding me.
I think that's
I appreciate
the point.
It. Good. Well, we do. I'll just like run through some of the sort of vital statistics from that time to rejog a few people's memories, a few of the listeners' memories. So it was a league before the league reconstruction and the Scottish Premiership became the Scottish Premiership. And no, wait, did it become the Scottish Premiership in 2013?
Yes.
God, so many name changes. So this continued being.
Yeah, so when the SPL formed as a breakaway, one of the conditions was that they said they were 10 teams originally, and they had to get an agreement for the SFA, and one of the things they said is we'll expand to 12 teams within 2 years. So this was expanding to 12 teams basically, which is also what brought, not in this season, the future season, the advent of the split. So that was kind of why it expanded, but it was still the SPL. It just went from 10 to 12.
Aye, that was a brain fart from me. The other rebranding to the Premiership was 2013. So yeah, Rangers won the league pretty comfortably. Celtic were second, Hearts were third. Aberdeen finished bottom. We'll go into more detail about that later, but they didn't get relegated. St Mirren and Dunfermline were the teams that come up. St Mirren as champions. That was then known as the second tier was known as the first division then. The second division was won by Clyde. They beat Alloa to the title by a point. And the third division was won by Queen's Park. Albion Rovers were the bottom team in the... I was going to call it the SPFL. This is going to be like a weird sort of mental challenge to like go between all the different brands and titles and all that kind of stuff. Across the 4 Scottish divisions, Albion Rovers finished the bottom of the lot. We had 2 cup finals involving Aberdeen. They finished bottom of the league and made it to 2 cup finals, losing both. One to Celtic, one to Rangers. And so that's kind of like an overview of how the leagues went. Do you guys want to chuck in what your main memories of that season, or fill in some of the gaps that I've provided there? Probably should have said somebody. Craig, you go. Craig, you've already started talking. You go.
We could talk about our own teams and our experience of our own teams, which aren't maybe going to be featured in any more detail. This was not the best season for Kilmarnock. You said Aberdeen finished bottom of the league. We finished just ahead of them. This was in the midst of quite a good era for the club. So we'd won the Scottish Cup a couple of years previously. Were regulars in Europe, and had finished, I think, 4th the season before, and I think finished 4th or 5th the season after as well. But this one was a bit of a slump, though we did have a nice foray into Europe. I've made a wee note to talk about everyone's performances in Europe later on, so I'll leave that as something to kind of round off with at the end. But we did get a bit of a glamour tie against Kaiserslautern in this season, and that kind of relationship between the two clubs has kind of endured since then. So there is it was a notable season in that respect, but not a particularly good one on the pitch for Killie.
I would just continue that theme then, Sean. What do you remember of it from a sort of Wraith Rovers perspective?
The only thing that is even remotely notable was... So basically, like, Wraith had been on the slide for a few seasons since they came back down from the top tier in, whatever it was, 96, 97. So this is very much a kind of mid-table finish in the first division. And the only thing that is worth noting is that up until about, whatever it is, 2 months ago, this season contained the last time we'd beat Inverness Caledonia Thistle. So that's like the only thing that's worth noting about this campaign.
That's pretty good. I was, we both would have been there for that hoodoo finally being ended when Jamie Gullen slammed the ball in the last few minutes.
And then and Mum fell.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Yeah, I hope she's recovered. Because
she seemed fine. She seemed fine. He was interviewed in a Q&A on Rover's Instagram, and he was asked, "Is your mum okay?" He went, "Yes, she's absolutely fine." So that's good to hear.
Maybe she could teach him a thing or two about getting over bumps and bruises. So that's pretty poor. He's had a horrendous time with injury. I'm sorry, Jamie. Okay, so let's move on to... We've all been tasked with bringing one thing each to the table here from the season that we're going to kind of look at and discuss in more depth. So let's start with you, Craig. What have you brought?
So 4 words, or no, more than 4 words, I can't count, but a newspaper headline that kind of sent shockwaves around the world, I think. You pointed out it was from The Sun. I don't want to endorse The Sun, but it was Super Cali go ballistic, Celtic are atrocious. 8th of February 2000, Celtic won Inverness Caledonian Thistle 3 in the Scottish Cup. Definitely a seismic result in terms of, I think it was pretty much what brought Inverness Caledonian Thistle into the kind of psyche of Scottish football. I think they'd obviously been in the league or existed as a club for a few years at that point, but had been kind of obviously kicking about the lower leagues, had been gradually making their way up, and this 99-2000 season was their first campaign in the first division. They went on to finish 6th that season in the first division, but the highlight for them was this trip to Celtic Park, a delayed trip to Celtic Park where they eventually knocked out Celtic, and also ended the managerial reign of a very brief managerial reign of John Barnes.
Yeah, that was definitely, when you mentioned this, that was kind of the thing that I found most interesting revisiting. I know this one game is all about Inverness, and that result did kind of, that defined them for quite a number of years, I feel, that result. And but looking back on this, it was a really interesting season for Celtic. They kind of had that managerial, it was sort of, I was going to say experiment, and I don't really mean that about John Barnes, but I just mean like the sort of setup with him and Kenny Dalglish, and then they like draw their first game 4-4 with Aberdeen or something like that. And there's just a lot of players that were signed that were maybe written off as duds that went on to be very good players for Celtic, and in amongst there a few guys that never really came on. But yeah, I thought that was looking back, I thought it was a really interesting time in Celtic's history. What are your memories of this sort of time for Inverness or Celtic, Sean?
So in terms of Inverness, so the weird thing was they weren't a good first division team. Like they finished mid-table. They under Stevie Patterson. Like going forward, they had so much quality going forward, but defensively they were dreadful. I mean, they conceded about 55 goals that season, which hampered them because they could score goals for fun. But the weird thing is, watching the highlights back, as much as because I kind of read a bit about the game before I'd watched the highlights back again, and like the stuff was suggesting that Inverness were the better team on the night. Like maybe they were, like, to try and gauge how a game goes on 6 minutes worth of highlights is always slightly tricky. But certainly based on what I've seen, like Celtic had chances, but it kind of looked like Inverness defended very well, but they didn't really do that over the course of the season. But I wasn't surprised that they caused Celtic issues, because going forward they had so much quality. I was trying to remember how I found out about the result, and I'm always conscious of the fact that I sound like I know I'm always, well, I am like the old man of the podcast, but like seeing now, like if this was happening at Parkhead, if Celtic were 1-0 down, 2-1 down, 3-1 down at Celtic Park to a first division team, you would find it on WhatsApp. You would see it on Twitter or whatever. Like you wouldn't, it wouldn't be a shock. But I remember at the time,
it was a midweek night, wasn't it? I can't remember which round it was.
It was a Tuesday or a Wednesday or whatever, and I think I hadn't been out. I had just been watching a film, and then I put Sky Sports News on, and there was that kind of yellow banner. Inverness Caledonian official knocks Celtic at the Scottish Cup. I remember I made like a weird noise. It was like kind of high pitch. What? But so like you wouldn't, like the same thing wouldn't happen now, because you just wouldn't have this, or almost certainly wouldn't happen now. Like you would have an inkling of what was going on at Celtic Park, and you would be getting updates. But I suppose ultimately it was Inverness kind of built in there and then became the Premiership side. And as much as it was a kind of painful 90 minutes for Celtic, by the summer Martin O'Neill was involved, so maybe ultimately it done them some good, but I doubt they thought that at the time.
I think the thing what you say with that Inverness team is, like, at the time they may not have been up to much in the first division, but you look through it and several, in fact the majority of that team would go on and play with them for quite a few years in the top flight, because you had Stuart Golobeck, who never amazing but did play for them for a while longer. Bobby Mann was there, Richard Hastings was there, Paul Sheeran, who had a pretty good career at other clubs as well. Ross Tokley.
I was about to say Tokley, but I couldn't remember if Tokley was part of, like, a stalwart of that team, or whether he came through as a youngster in that team and then became a sort of stalwart.
He was playing that game. Barry Wilson played in that game.
Barry Wilson, he was a great player.
Dennis Wyness as well. The other players, Charlie Christie, so obviously went on to manage them, Ryan's dad, and the interesting one was our goalkeeper, Jim Calder, who was 39 years old and 15 years earlier. Yep, 1985. He had played for Inverness Caledonian against Celtic at Celtic Park when
Holy
they'd get
fuck.
beaten 6-0. But he played for them as a centre forward. So he used to be a striker, and then he got a career-ending injury and became a goalkeeper, and would end up playing for Inverness in goals.
That's a great
So,
story.
yeah.
Apparently, he became a goalkeeper at age 26.
So only once his basically his career was ended as a forward. So he'd come on as a sub in a 6-0 defeat as a striker, and then would be the goalkeeper that helped him to win. And he did pull off a couple of saves for a 39-year-old. Not too bad. A few other things on Inverness. So that you said the game was midweek. That was because the originally scheduled Saturday match, which had been 10 days earlier, an hour before kick-off, so Inverness had already made their way there. The fans would presume they already made their way there. It was called off because there was strong winds and a bit of the roof of Celtic Park was like loose and blown about. So it was called off for safety reasons. And despite that, when it was rescheduled 10 days later for midweek, there were 4,000 Inverness fans down at the game, which is ludicrous to think of now. But I suppose it's that kind of, like, Inverness play at Celtic Park. I mean, not recently, but they became pretty regular playing against teams like that, so it wasn't such a big thing at the time. But 4,000 turned up for it. And apparently the Celtic directors paid for several crates of beer for the Inverness team to take up the road, which I find quite
that backfired.
No,
trying to like get them steaming.
After the win.
2-day hangover. Oh, it was after the win, right? Sorry, I thought you were talking about after they had driven down all that way for no game. Send them back up the road pissed.
But I mean, some of the parts of that were coming from a nice nutmeg article on the game, but there was a few other kind of notable things, obviously. So Mark Viduka was one of the kind of key people of this year. He won Player of the Year, I think, in the Premiership, or the top flight Player of the Year for the season. Mark Viduka was in the midst of a 10-game scoring streak in the top flight. So he scored in 10 consecutive league games, and amongst that, something that was only recently usurped by Kevin Van Veen. But that was kind of a record as such, not an all-time record, but certainly kind of modern era record for quite a while. But Viduka maybe didn't have the best of nights against Inverness in that at half-time. So I should say that the Celtic team, Jonathan Gould, Tom Boyd, Oliver Tebbelly, Stefan Mahy, Vidar Riseth, Colin Healy.
Had to Google him.
Reggie Blinker.
Couldn't remember who he was.
Lubo Moravcik, Ayo Berkovic, Mark Viduka, and Mark Burchell. So Henrik Larsson had broken his leg out in Lyon. Quite a kind of famous that was also during this season. At half-time, Celtic were 2-1 down. So Barry Wilson had given Inverness the lead, but Celtic had equalised almost instantly with Mark Burchell, but then a Moravcik own goal had sent Inverness in 2-1 up. At half-time, and I think Bobby Mann said this in an interview at one point, the Celtic, it didn't seem right with the Celtic team all night, but at half-time they were apparently just tearing strips off each other in the dressing room, and Eric Black tried to kind of G up Viduka by asking if he didn't fancy it or whatever, if he tried to get a reaction of him. And apparently what Viduka said is, fuck this bollocks, and threw his boots in the bin and just stormed off, and had to be replaced at half-time by Ian Wright. Just another name that just appears like...
This kind of leads on nicely to I kind of mentioned it earlier when we were talking in the group chat about it, but I found the Scottish Premiership top scorer list for that season very interesting. Mark Viduka, who you're talking about, goes on to win Player of the Year. He scores 25. Billy Dodds scores 19 across spells for Dundee United and Rangers. Jorg Alberts, 17 for Rangers. Rod Wallace, 16 for Rangers. Gary McSwagan, 13 for Hearts. Willie Faulkner, in the twilight of his career, 12 for Dundee. Mark Burchell got 11 for Celtic. Kenny Miller, a young Kenny Miller, got 11 for Hibs. John Spencer, another veteran, got 11 for Motherwell. And then it goes on to like Nathan Lowndes, Michael Moles, Tommy Johnson. A real mixed list there. Like some like fading legends and like players at the top of their game, and then some like guys like fucking Nathan Lowndes in there. I thought it was interesting.
I love it when those eras overlap like that. But yeah, that was obviously, it wasn't all right for Celtic during that game. And Jonathan Gould said we needed leadership, and John didn't provide it. He was in a situation he didn't have the experience to handle. So Johnny Gould, the man who conceded 3 goals during this game, was pointing the finger at the manager, certainly. But they came out in the second half and ended up. It was a penalty, and Paul Sheeran scored it, and Inverness won the game. I think the only other things to note, I guess, John Barnes ended up being sacked a couple of days after this. Olivier Tebele had a bit of an interesting time of it over those few days because he had been away with Ivory Coast in the African Nations Cup. They got knocked out of the group stage in what was a pretty tough group. They had Ghana, Cameroon and Togo in their group. All 4 teams finished on 4 points, but they lost out on goal difference. But when they flew back into the Ivory Coast, they were detained at a military camp for 3 days by the new president, who basically thought they were they'd let the country down, and FIFA and etc. had to negotiate their release. And this was his first game back, so very much kind of out of the frying pan and into the fire, or whatever the saying is. But it was obviously kind of one of those seminal results. I would say it was kind of it did send shockwaves, I think, beyond even Scottish football at that point, because I think I'm right in saying it was the first time Celtic had ever lost a cup tie at home to lower league opposition, and it's certainly not happened that many times since. So it was pretty big in that respect. Inverness would go on to be knocked out in the next round. They played Aberdeen in the next round. They were actually leading with 10 minutes to go at home, got pegs back to 1 each, and then lost narrowly in the replay. But within a couple of years, they would go on to be promoted to top flight, and obviously have since gone on and won the Scottish Cup. So it was very much a moment where they announced themselves onto the scene.
I noticed like Ian Wright came on for Viduka at half time, and I was like, well, let's have a wee look at this, because Celtic went through a real stage where they would bring up players from the English league that had a lot of brilliant careers down south, then bring them back up north, towards the end of their career. And Roy Keane played in the defeat at Clyde. Ian Wright came on at half time in a defeat against Inverness. Robbie Keane came north and played in the semi-final defeat at Ross County. And then the one I was trying to get right, can we do a kind of quadruple here, like Craig Bellamy? So Craig Bellamy won the Scottish Cup as far as I'm aware. However, Craig Bellamy also played in the game where Celtic lost in the last day of the season to Motherwell 2-1 and Rangers won the league. So what I would suggest is, if I was a Celtic fan or on the Celtic board, don't bring up players that have had really good careers in England when they're coming to the end of a career to come up and to north to play to sign for Celtic. It doesn't seem to go well.
Slightly related, I think, is, and I'm going off memory here, so I'm bound to get something wrong, but a different season, much later, Carlton Cole, did he not score his only Celtic goal in a very sort of turgid performance against like East Kilbride in the Cup or something like that? Is that right?
I think that's right. They definitely played East Kilbride,
and it was a terrible goal.
They had him and Colin Kazim Richards around the same time. I was thinking Freddie Ljungberg didn't even make enough of an impression to even have a
Juninho.
Yeah. But yes, I think your thesis is probably quite appropriate there, Sean. I think it might be worth considering.
Okay, I think we've gone into that in a fair bit of detail. What about, we'll stick with you, Sean? What have you brought with us? With us? With you? To us?
I went with this. I went with a situation I have. Like, I don't recall before. Maybe it has happened. Maybe it's happened since. But basically, Hamilton Accies went on strike. Like, that feels like very unusual, and I do think that the punishment that was kind of meted out, I'm not entirely sure it was justified. However, maybe you disagree. I'm not entirely sure. But basically, Hamilton were in the second division at the time, so the third tier. Now, it's interesting that right from the word go. So in July of 1999, the wages arrived late, and the Hamilton chairman was Jim Sherry, and he said that the quote was, "There was a hiccup. It was a temporary shortage of funds because we needed to move money from one account to another, and we required a signature." So that, like, right away at the start of that season, I felt like something wasn't quite right, and there was money issues right the way through that season. And then what happened was, on the 1st of April, with Hamilton safe in mid-table, I think they were sitting 5th at the time, their players had had enough. So bounces have been, checks have been bouncing. I think 5 times out of 6 they hadn't been paid properly, and they'd suggested that they might go on strike if things didn't happen. Things didn't go correctly at the end of March. That didn't happen, so they failed to turn up for a game at Oakoview against Stenhousemuir. So initially, a spokesperson for the SFL had said that they'd probably be fined and there'd be a 3 points deduction. What actually happened was that there was a 15 points deduction. So rather than being mid-table, that put them behind Queen of South. There was only one team getting relegated at that season because of league reconstruction. Now, they still had a few games to save themselves. They still had 7 games to go. Queen of South went in good form. Actually, Hamilton were in good form going into that points deduction. However, I think they only won 2 of the next 7 games, lost maybe 3 and drew the rest. Queen of South done just enough to sustain that gap, and Hamilton got relegated. But ultimately, like, you kind of look at the comments from board members at that time and some of the other excuses for why payments bounced over the course of the season, and it doesn't look well in Hamilton. I do think at the same time, from the authorities' perspective, it felt like they were kind of punishing the wrong people. Like, surely, like, when you look at that as whether it was the Scottish Football League or the SFA, you think, right, well, let's try and make sure that players aren't put in this position where they're not getting paid what they should be getting paid. But it kind of felt like they punished the club rather than do anything to protect players in a similar scenario going forward. So, it was. I'm not sure anybody comes out of it very well, but there's a very, very interesting reason why the wages weren't paid. I think in March, which is very unusual. But I must admit, I did like that. But overall, a kind of shoddy period for Hamilton. And I'm not entirely sure they've moved forward in any shape, way, or form since then.
Yeah, as a precursor. What was the strange reason the wages weren't paid?
So basically, in March, let me get this right now. A strike action was averted in March as part of the wages that were due arrived late, but a promise to pay the balance was made. Controlling shareholder Jim Watson said the delay was due to a legal wrangle with former chairman George Whitelaw, who sought payment for the storage of Douglas Park's floodlights at a rate of £1 per metre per week.
Okay.
So basically, somebody was storing Douglas Park's floodlights, but he was charging them £1 per metre per week. That sounds like a very unusual rate It's an unusual rate.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like,
I mean, I've never been
presumably
involved.
The floodlights are really long.
I've never been involved in floodlight storage, but I've certainly never heard of anything being charged by length.
How can you do it by metre? How can you do it by metre? It's an area. Areas aren't measured in metres; they're measured in square metres. So what the?
Well, but
volume, in fact, in cubic metres, surely.
But you obviously weren't involved in terms of signing that contract.
Yeah, what if you just turn them the other way?
£1 per
You could just. I'm only wanting. You could just measure the bottom of them. I'm only paying for this length.
Yeah.
That froze their assets. So they had to pay him £9,500. So that froze £35,000 off their assets. So they couldn't get paid that month. I mean, let's face it, nothing was going particularly well. I must admit, I do think that 15 points deduction, which put them behind Queen of South, that felt a wee bit severe.
That is an interesting one.
I almost felt like the punishment was, let's just relegate them, rather than how can we ensure that no players are put in this position again?
Where you're further punishing the players potentially, because then reduce wage and fans, so that's where it becomes a sort of interesting one, because how do you mete out that punishment with where it's sort of like targeted at the right people? And I don't know. Obviously, only speculating, but I wonder whether it was like them. That was their way of not wanting to be involved in the dispute, and they were just punishing the club as a whole for not fulfilling fixtures. I don't know.
I think there's a difference, because you hear people say that, like, oh, you shouldn't punish the players or the fans, when the club have like almost cheated to gain an advantage. So they've been overplaying players and have gone into administration or whatever it may be. But in a number of cases, and this would be one of them, that isn't really what happened. So I think there is a difference to drawing it, and it does. I do agree with you. It seemed it wasn't like Hamilton Accies were were gaining any advantage by that situation beyond they were just being run by absolute people who maybe didn't have the club's best interest in heart, something which may have continued over the years, even as they gained 3 promotions in the space of like the following 8 years, I think. But they obviously, when you're talking about the storage of the Douglas Park floodlights, they were playing at Firhill at that point because they'd sold Douglas Park off, which I think is where the Sainsbury's is now, like next to New Douglas Park. I think that's correct. But hadn't yet been building what is now New Douglas Park. So they had spent some time, I think, at Clifton Hill and then were at Firhill as well. And it'd be another 2 years, I think, or a year or two before New Douglas Park opened. But it felt very odd, and I think it's one of the biggest, I think it is the biggest points deduction that's ever been dished out. Maybe, Dundee had 25 after that, but I think it's the second biggest in the history. So it was certainly severe, but I guess it's rare for a team not to turn up for a game as well. So there's probably not a lot of precedent for that.
So I was going to ask if there's been any situations like this since, and obviously there's been situations with players not getting paid and delayed payments and things like that. But yeah, you're right. Other than a few cases, I think Ryan Stevenson, did he not maybe leave Hearts when he wasn't getting paid? But they fulfilled all their fixtures despite the wage issues 2011-12 season. But yeah, has there been any other? Does anybody know of any other cases? The closest thing I can think of is the referees going on strike, but that's obviously quite different.
Yeah, and just to, I guess, a wee addendum, they would go on to win the third division the following season on goal difference from Cowdenbeath, and ended up. I think that was a very narrow finish to the season. I think maybe the top 3 were all in the battle right up to the end of it, but they ended up winning that, and obviously on the pitch at least, kind of, it was probably a catalyst for a very positive spell for Hamilton Accies, where they obviously spent the best part of a decade, kind of, or more actually, in the top flight. So
maybe lucky to do that again.
It may have kind of been one of these siege mentalities, but certainly I'm sure it didn't feel like that at the time.
I did enjoy the Stennismuir chairman who said, Terry Bullock, who said that they should just be relegated like immediately after the game. Stennismuir were involved in a relegation tussle at the time, so I did wonder if that may have influenced his position.
Okay, shall we move into what I've brought? Kind of alluded to it earlier when I mentioned that Aberdeen had finished bottom of the Premiership and not been relegated. I'm going to talk about just Aberdeen's season, so we're going to leave it open as that Aberdeen season, because to be honest, when I looked at it all, it was just so batshit crazy that I couldn't pick one aspect of it. So we'll give an overview and then we'll see where we want to dive into. So in a nutshell, finished bottom of the league. There was supposed to be a 3-way playoff between them and the top 2 teams in the second tier, which top of the second tier was being promoted, and then the next 2 were going to be in a 3-way playoff with the bottom of the Scottish Premier League. So St Mirren came up as champions, and then Dunfermline and Falkirk were the teams in second and third. Falkirk, as has kind of become quite an infamous tale in Scottish football, they did not have their stadium did not meet the kind of harsh requirements that were being enforced at that time. 10,000 all-seater, and in fact, let's just do a wee sort of detour here, Sean, because you're probably well placed to speak about this. But that rule in general, I mean, it stopped Falkirk from being promoted, but there's other teams that at great expense got their stadium up to that. And I suppose Wraith's quite a good example where they invested the money and then it kind of hamstrung them for a while after that.
Yeah, I totally. So Wraith managed to get the seats in place eventually. I think it was I'm saying what season it was, 95, 96 maybe. They started the season off. They'd asked for away games so they could finish their stadium basically. Thankfully, we were given away games at Celtic Park and Ibrox. So by the time we got back to Starts Park when everything was finished, we're already bottom of the league because we conceded about 11 goals, and it never really got any better. But you're right. It's like there was a weird thing where you had to have all these seats to come into the top tier. I don't know if anybody wanted it. Certainly nobody needed it. And the weird thing about Falkirk was they couldn't leave the first division for a variety of reasons. So this season they couldn't leave it because their stadium wasn't very good. But then 2 seasons later, like they were dreadful. Like still in the first division, dreadful. Should have got relegated, finished 9th, but they couldn't get relegated because I think Airdrie went bust from the division below. So you had this weird spell where Falkirk couldn't get promoted, couldn't get relegated, no matter what they did, no matter how good they were, no matter how bad they were. They just had to spend their entirety in the first division.
It's kind of like now with League One, isn't it?
If only
Just
they would
doesn't
try and
matter
get
what they do,
relegated.
they fuck it up
If only they
somehow.
would try and get relegated, that would be class.
Yeah, but I've not mentioned actually who Aberdeen were being managed by at this point, and that's Ebbe Skovdahl. And we could probably do an entire podcast on that man and his guidance of Aberdeen this season. But if you've ever heard the stats and miniskirts quote, then that was his. And like I say, they finished bottom of the league, but they still managed to make it to two cup finals, and even one of those was really bizarre. So they were coming up against Rangers in the Scottish Cup final, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head now, but I think it was 3 subs you were allowed to be named, and there was no rule about whether you had to name a goalkeeper or not. And Skovdahl decided to go with an extra outfield player, and that backfired because within it's like 5 or 6 minutes or something like that, Jim Leighton is taken off after lengthy treatment, and they have to stick Robbie Winters in goals. Now, they were probably up against it already, but playing an entire Scottish Cup final with a striker in goals, they never really stood a chance, did they?
It was also the fact you've then got Robbie Winters, who's like he was young at the time, but obviously quite a promising. I don't know if he wasn't that young; he was in his mid-20s, but quite a promising striker. You've also got used one of your substitute strikers who you maybe thought you could bring on to change the game is now in goals for you. But yeah, I think it wasn't uncommon at the time not to have a sub goalkeeper on the bench. Rangers didn't for this game either.
Yeah, because it's like a 1 in 500 event or something like that.
It doesn't happen.
Yeah, maybe even that's being generous. It's probably like much less than that.
But there was Jim Leighton. He was 41 by that point, nearly 42. So that was the last game of his career. So very ignominious end to his career.
It's really sad to say, but it kind of sums up his career in a way, doesn't it? Because it's like getting to a Scottish Cup final. Yeah. It's like obviously like that's a good thing, but then it's like backfire. And Jim Leighton, I feel like was a person in Scottish football that good things constantly happened to him, but then it was constantly taken away from him by horrible things happening.
It's weird because bearing in mind that Jim Leighton had 91 caps for Scotland, played for Man United, won umpteen trophies for Aberdeen, and I kind of feel sorry for him. But bearing in mind my career is standard life in my career is standard life in Tesco, so surely Jim Leighton should feel sorry for me. But looking at his career, overall, the things that, for whatever reason, rightly or wrongly, the things that I remember is playing in that FA Cup final down south and then not being able to play in the replay. His last game for Aberdeen, getting kicked in the jaw by Rod Wallace. Was it a broken jaw maybe that kind of ended that game for him. Even Euro 96. They basically played all the qualifiers for us, but then Andy Gorham played in the kind of Euro 96 tournament. So there's always something that I feel very, very sorry for him. And even when I was looking at that, so after this game, he was scheduled to have a testimonial for Aberdeen. So I think his very first performance was against Middlesbrough, maybe in a friendly for Aberdeen. So they played them again for his final ever performance. But he couldn't play in it because he's still recovering for that injury in the Scottish Cup final. I was just like, oh, poor Jim. And that's how I've always kind of regarded Jim Leighton. I always feel very, very sorry for him, rightly or wrongly. But that's a terrible way to end your career.
To bring it full circle as well, Robbie Winters had to wear Ryan Essendon's shirt because Ryan Essendon was the sub goalkeeper and had travelled and everything onto the pitch. And then 15 years later, Ryan Essendon won the Scottish Cup playing for Inverness. To tie it in nicely to my story as well, he was the starting goalkeeper for Inverness when they won the cup. So
nice.
his jersey didn't do so well in that final, but he himself would have some vengeance, I guess, 15 years on.
I was going to say it looked very big on him, but looking at the style around that time, it was
big.
It was a very baggy era. It was definitely a very baggy era. And we've not really touched on their league form, which was...
It wasn't good.
No, it obviously wasn't good, but it was still a bit bizarre the way it unfolded. As I said, they drew their first game. I believe it was their first game 4-4 with Celtic, but then they didn't win.
You said that earlier, Craig, but I don't think they did.
Oh, is this 5-0?
Am I getting mixed up with something else?
They drew 4 each with Celtic like years later, I'm sure. But
fuck, where am I getting that from then?
But I was just letting that slide the first time, but I thought,
Jesus Christ, and I've just repeated it.
They lost their first 7 games, so they didn't score in the first 6. They got beat 5-0 at Pittodrie by Celtic.
Jesus
in the
Christ,
day.
right, okay.
And then also then in the 9th game of the season, so they finally thought their season was turning around because they drew with Hibs in their 8th game, a 2-2 draw with Hibs, and then they went to Celtic Park and got beat 7-0. So 9 games into the season, they had 1 point and had scored 3 goals and conceded quite a lot. And then what happened in game number 10?
They beat Motherwell 6-5 to win their first game of the season. And two legendary Scotland goalkeepers were in goals that day. Jim Leighton, as we've already spoken about, and Andy Gorham was in goals for Motherwell. Yeah, so this 4-4 thing, I remember that being a lot. I some reason have it in my head that was like a Barnes era thing. Now, clearly the facts are telling me something different. So I'm now trying to decide whether I'm putting it down to the COVID that I have or whether is this a Mandela effect thing?
I think it is. I think in your reality, that's when it happened. So we can't argue with you.
There we go.
I must admit, I did see when I was looking on the 3-way playoff that was obviously eventually abandoned. I ended up on an Aberdeen football forum, and they were discussing the fact that a Rangers fan, so somebody started a thread, an Aberdeen fan started a thread, because a Rangers fan at their work had said that they were very lucky to still be in the Premiership or the top tier and should have been relegated twice. And there was a discussion about how that 3-way playoff would have went, and somebody said, now, you know something? Aberdeen were very much coming into form. We very much had momentum at the end of the season. There is absolutely no chance we would have got relegated. I was like, right, okay, I'll have a wee look at that. So, yes, admittedly, they did win the last 2 games. They beat Dundee and Kilmarnock and Dead Rubbers. They won 3 out of the last 13 league games. Bear in mind, they would have been up against Dunfermline and Falkirk. Had a look at Dunfermline. They won 5 of the last 6. And Falkirk lost 2 out of 20, and the only teams that beat them were St Mirren, who won the league, and Hibs in the Scottish Cup. So I will say, and nobody, I suppose, can say I'm wrong, that I think Aberdeen would have got absolutely scudded in that playoff.
They played Falkirk at Pittodrie in the League Cup and drew with them, so they certainly were not streets ahead. I mean, it's worth mentioning again that Aberdeen's entire history in the Scottish top flight is entirely based on a sham because they never gained promotion in the first place. So if you look back to when Aberdeen were elected to the top flight of Scottish football, they actually finished in the bottom half of the second tier. And albeit this is like over a century ago, but they finished in, I think, 7th place in the Division 2 in the 1904-05 season, and they out of 12 teams, and they were elected ahead of 5 separate teams who finished above them. So when they say that they've never been relegated from the top flight, which is true, they are certainly There's question marks over the validity of all of their league titles, certainly, I would suggest.
So if you were applying that logic, could you not then say that anybody who's been voted into the SPFL and not promoted into it, could you say the same thing about them?
Well, but they didn't. Yeah, anyone who didn't finish top of the league below, I would argue, yes.
Okay. So like there's a few teams in the SPFL right now who think they're building up histories, and you think it's just the whole thing's a sham.
There should potentially be asterisks behind quite a few.
A full fucking. You imagine how many there'd be. The Rangers ones, the Celtic ones when Rangers weren't in the league. All the Hearts ones for when they financially doped. Not titles, obviously. That would just be cups.
All I'm saying is they should think twice about whether their league titles really count for much.
Well, that was a bit of that was an ominous note to end on. Does anybody else want to add anything else from this season before we'll hang about for another wee while? Just like anything else you found interesting about this season?
There was a couple of things for me, and I think Sean was maybe going to talk about international, so I'll just talk about kind of performances in Europe, because there was a couple of quite glamour ties that Scottish clubs were involved in. So we'll just run through what all the clubs did in Europe. So Rangers were the one representative in the Champions League, and they beat Finnish side Haka very comfortably, 7-1 on aggregate. And then they played in the final qualifying round for the Champions League, Parma. And this was around the time, I think they'd also played Parma the season before and been knocked out of the UEFA Cup. And they played them at Ibrox and won 2-0. Claudio Reyna and Tony Vidmar got the goals. And then they went out to Italy and they got beat 1-0, but held on to go through to the Champions League, which was, I certainly remember that game. It was obviously quite a big result for a Scottish team to knock out a Serie A team at that point, and certainly one of the better ones. They went into the Champions League group stage with Valencia, Bayern Munich and PSV, so pretty tough sounding group. They lost away to Valencia. I think Valencia went on to, in fact, Valencia and Bayern went on to the final, both of them in this season, which gives you a clue as to what happened with Rangers in this group stage. But they lost in Valencia, and then they played Bayern and lost a last minute equaliser at home, so they drew 1 each. They then beat PSV home and away, with Ruud van Nistelrooy scoring a consolation in a 4-1 win for Rangers, which meant actually that when they played Valencia at Ibrox, as it turned out, if they'd beaten Valencia at Ibrox, they would have gone through. They lost that game 2-1, which set up a game away to Bayern Munich, where a draw would have actually taken them through at the expense of Bayern, but they lost 1-0. That took them down into the UEFA Cup, where they played Borussia Dortmund, who they again beat 2-0 at Ibrox, and yet again conceded a last-minute equaliser. They lost 2-0 in Germany, with Freddy Bobic scoring in the 92nd minute to take it to extra time. Freddy Bobic's goal was set up by Jens Lehmann, who had come up for a corner. And they went on to lose on penalties, with Giovanni van Bronckhorst being one of the people who missed a penalty. So he maybe instilled that into Aaron Ramsey for a few years later. And whoever else missed a penalty for Rangers that no one ever remembers. Celtic beat Cumbrae Town 10-0 on aggregate in the UEFA Cup. Anyone would beat a Welsh team comfortably, clearly. And beat Maccabi Tel Aviv before they lost to Lyon, where Henrik Larsson broke his leg. But that's the kind of boring to...
I remember being in... I'm going to try to remember the name of the place. Is it Locarno's? It's in Shandon in Edinburgh. It's upstairs. It's above the Shandon. It was either that or the Shandon Snooker Hall next door. I can't remember. And that game was on a big projector. And I remember us going up to the projector while they were showing like the slow-mo replays and like seeing, like, I got a proper view of how horrific that leg break looked. Yeah, you couldn't really see.
It's a very floppy leg.
Yeah, so it wasn't really so much about what you could see the leg doing. It was how much the sort of shin pad was being pushed up by. Yeah. That was a horrific injury.
It's actually kind of incredible that he actually came back during that season. He played a couple of games at the end of the season and went and played in the Euros for Sweden. So obviously then kind of he'd been good before it, but went on to be obviously a quite good player.
Yeah.
St Johnstone had finished third the season before, so they were also in the UEFA Cup, and they beat VPS of Finland. They scored a couple of late goals in Perth to win that game, and got the glamour tie of all glamour ties, I would argue, in European football, which is against Monaco. In terms of an away trip, I don't think there are many more glamorous places you could really
rings
go.
a bell, man. I didn't look up the European runs, but yeah, a couple of the ones that you mentioned before rung a bell, but that one, yeah, that does as well.
So the first leg, they went out to Monte Carlo, and they were actually drawn 0-0 until the 69th minute in that game, but ended up losing 3-0. And David Trezeguet was one of the players who scored for St Johnstone.
4 years.
For Monaco. And amongst a year before he scored the winning goal in the
yeah, I was also going to say 4 years before Monaco went to the Champions League final.
Yep, and they had so some of the players playing for Monaco, Fabian Barthez was in goal, Rafael Marquez and Ludovic Giuli, who both won the Champions League with Barcelona. They had David Trezeguet. They had Marcelo Gallardo, who was the kind of Argentina star at the time. Costinha, who went on to play for Porto against Monaco in the final, I think. They had Willy Sagnol, who obviously had a good career with France. John Arnorisa, who won the Champions League as well with Liverpool, and they had Dado Purcell as well.
Oh, yeah.
So they then played them at St McDiarmid Park and drew 3 each. So they kind of had a pretty good time of it against Monaco, and the other one was Kelly were in Europe through the fair play scheme. So we'd finished fourth the previous season, so it wasn't like we would have been the next in line. It had been quite a battle with Kelly and St Johnstone for third place in that season. And Kelly squeezed past KR Reykjavik, so we lost in Iceland and needed a 90th minute goal at home. Paul Wright scored a penalty to get to extra time where we won that game. And Kelly ended up playing Djorkaeff FC. They ended up playing Kaiserslautern, and Yuri Djorkaeff, who was again had just won the World Cup with France, tore us to bits. And so that was a European season. So as usual, basically all done before Christmas, but some big names kind of, and I feel like this was maybe one of the last seasons, more or less, where teams like Kelly and St Johnstone could really get ties like that. I mean, I know St Johnstone played Galatasaray, but that felt like a bit of a fluke of the draw rather than something that would be expected to happen.
Has the Conference League maybe made it more possible?
Potentially.
Because then you could have, it's basically bigger teams having poor seasons, basically. So yeah, you can maybe opens up more of the chance of it now. Anything else, Sean? Have you got anything else from this season?
Only probably from an international perspective. So Scotland had, so the qualifiers for Euro 2000, we were a number 1 seed. We'd been we'd been grouped with the Czechs, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Lithuania, Estonia, and the Faroes. And like the Czechs, like you go through that team, that might be one of the best number 2 seeds of all time. Like just incredible. Like they won all of our games, 30 points. We kind of struggled, albeit only 2 games lost against the Czechs. However, dropped points in Estonia, dropped points in Lithuania, and dropped points in the Faroes. Most embarrassingly of all. But we made it to the playoffs as being one of the runners up. I think Portugal was the best runners up. We're about 4 points removed from them. So we had a couple of better results to be the best runners up. And as much as we've maybe been in the playoffs since, and we've wanted it to be an open draw, and it maybe hasn't been. It's been to do with seedings. For Euro 2000, it was an open draw, and I do think if it had been seeded, we would have been fine, or certainly better placed. But we ended up getting England. And I must admit, I still think that this was a missed opportunity. Like a missed opportunity in terms of playing against England in a genuinely competitive game, and we really had a chance to knock them out. Not because I think this Scotland team was better than England. I don't think that at all. Like look at England, like Michael Owen, Alan Shearer, Paul Scholes,
especially in that first leg.
Tony Adams. Like it was still that was a talented England team. However, they were managed by an idiot. They were managed by Kevin Keegan, who was not a football manager. Like I've seen him described as a cheerleader rather than a manager, and that probably sums him up. Like, and judging by what he said in the last kind of few months, he'd probably be okay with me saying he's not a football manager. But if like Amy Canavan had said he's not a football manager, he'd be really annoyed at that. So they were held back, I think, by him. But we were playing them at a good time, and we weren't able to make the most of it.
They'd really struggled in qualifying. I think they only won 3 games in their group, and 2 of those were against Luxembourg. But they did a lot of draws, and they were. Sweden basically let the whole football world down because England drew 0-0 out in Poland, where a defeat would have eliminated them, and that meant they needed Sweden to beat Poland in the last game to even qualify for the playoffs. And Sweden did, which is quite frankly embarrassing on their part, because they'd already qualified, they'd already won the group. It made no difference to Sweden, so just do what's funny.
We
would be my argument.
Did beat them in the second leg, courtesy of an Englishman. And we had chances to equalise. I remember Neil McCann going through on the keeper. Did Billy Dodds not have an opportunity as well? But yeah, we had our chances in that second half.
Daly could barely have met the kind of diving header with any more purpose, but it was just too close to David Seaman. And it was funny watching the 2 games back. So I've watched both games back for this because I knew it kind of took place in this season. My memory was that it was kind of eeksy-peeksy at Hampden, and we were probably slightly the better side at Wembley. Actually, we're the better side at Hampden as well. So even before England went 1 up, we had chances as soon as Scholes scored, which was poor defending, probably for Colin Henry. Barry Ferguson seemed to like run back and then stop as well, which probably didn't help matters, but I don't know if he could have got back. But even like 60 seconds later, Gallagher missed a sitter, and then 60 seconds after England went 2 up, I think it was Billy Dodds hit the bar when he could have done a bit better. And in the second half, it was pretty much all Scotland, albeit we didn't really create. It was half chances rather than really good chances. And like I always think when you hear people say, like Colin Henry said afterwards that like the better team had lost, it's like, well, that just feels like you're a sore loser. But I must admit, ultimately over the 180 minutes, that he might have had a case. I did enjoy after the first leg, 2-0 down, you're going to Wembley. Craig Brown was asked, like, well, how do you keep this tie alive? And he said, well, we've got a really good record in scoring in away games, so I think we still have a wee bit of a chance. I look back at the qualifying campaign, we drew 0-0 in Lithuania. We drew 0-0 in Estonia and drew 1-1 in the Faroes. Like, Craig, I don't know if that's entirely true.
Probably got more corners in each of them, though. It's probably what he's referring to.
A man that
a moral victory.
Just a man that is statistics daft, but honestly, fair play to him. A lovely, lovely man.
Well, we didn't score a goal, but I think you'll find that we had 12 corners to their 3. And at least they come out with shit like that. Doesn't matter, mate. It doesn't matter. Aye, Craig Brown. What a legend. What a legend. Is there anything else we want to chuck in here, or should we end on the memory of Craig Brown? What a lovely place to end. See you later on, guys.